And so, we delve into the lowest point of the Man of Tomorrow's career, which, given the road he's been down in the last 20 years, that's saying a lot. But to me, nothing has been as bad as this. The crowning achievement in showing how superhero movies can, at times, be the most soul-crushingly dull experiences you can ever have. That being Superman Returns. I do want to state clearly and for the record, I love Superman. I know he's not been getting as much appreciation these days because a lot of people complain that he's too powerful, or the setups for his character don't lead to the most interesting or complex stories, or that compared to other superheroes like Spider-Man or Batman, he's just not as compelling. And granted, those are valid complaints, but to me, Superman represents the hero who is above all others. And I don't mean that in an elitist way, I mean that he represents a point that all superheroes should strive to achieve. He is incorruptible and completely empathetic, and yet despite this, he is technically not perfect. He can make mistakes and he does learn from them, which makes him incredibly human, despite, of course, being an alien. Which in that regard, it also promotes not only that American ideal, but a worldly ideal that no matter where you come from, you can strive to be the best of yourself that you can be. But from an entertainment standpoint, it's just fun as hell seeing Superman fighting against threats that are larger than life, and also considering what's been happening in politics the last few years, seeing him beat someone like Lex Luthor over and over and over again is incredibly cathartic.
A bald, super rich bigot with way too much time on his hands? Yeah, that certainly sounds familiar.
And let's not forget that in the comics for a brief time, he was the president.
Maybe comic books aren't as unrealistic as we thought.
And that's something that a lot of Superman movies, particularly of the Millennium, don't really understand. They keep trying to show him in different ways that, I'll give them credit, it's ambitious, but it's not really something we want to see, such as Superman being an outright killer, or even making him the straight-up villain. And while all those things were bad, I'll give him credit that they're at least interestingly bad. This movie makes Superman the one thing that he should never be: forgettable. And that's the perfect way to sum up this movie. Completely forgettable. Really quickly, I'll give my opinion on the other Christopher Reeves movies, because this movie is technically a sequel to those.
And yet we didn't get to see Zod return.
That would have been good. Hell, I would have been happy to see Nuclear Man return. The first two movies are definitely a bit corny, and some elements haven't aged very well, such as the effects or the cinematography, but they do capture the true essence of what Superman is supposed to be. And to be fair, they were emblematic of the comics at that point, and they were trying to make a version of Superman that all ages could relate to. The third and fourth movies, yeah, I don't really know what they were going for with that, but I'll give the fourth one credit that at least does have some interesting elements to it, and sadly, probably some of the best action sequences in the series. I have no idea what motivated them to make a sequel to those movies instead of just trying to make a straight-up reboot of the franchise, but not only was it a hugely failed attempt, but it's also incredibly confusing as a result. So, what's the plot to this one? Lex Luthor discovers a Kryptonian crystal which, when added to water, will create an entirely new landmass. So essentially, Kryptonians invented countries in pill form. He mixes it with kryptonite and makes a land that he is completely in control of, and since it's made of kryptonite, Superman won't be able to do anything to stop him. That's really all the plot you need, because the plot is insanely overcomplicated and full of false drama that is really rather pointless. Even on paper, that sounds like it could make for an interesting story, but the main thing that brings this movie down is that it focuses on the wrong thing, that being the relationship between Lois and Clark. I'll grant you that's not inherently wrong. The relationship between them in the first two Christopher Reeves movies is really rather charming, and it really helps humanize Superman as a character. But this isn't Christopher Reeves and Margot Kidder here. It's Brandon Ross and Kate Bosworth, who are terrible in this movie.
I can't be gone long.
You won't be.
Richard, he's a pilot. He takes me up all the time.
Not like this.
They can't express any emotions whatsoever. They are so dull and insufferable, and in some points are really unlikable characters. Lois acts like a bitch to Clark because he's been off doing something called finding the remains of his home planet for the last 5 years.
I'm Clark Kent, an old friend of your mom's from before you were born.
Really? She never mentioned you.
Really?
Oh yeah, what a bastard. Granted, I'm not sure if she knows that Clark is Superman in this movie, so maybe that's justified if she is ignorant of that. But still, Lois has been very understanding in these movies, and here she's just really unlikable, just so icy with a big chip on her shoulder. It just doesn't work for Lois Lane. She's also even more stupid this time, if that's even possible.
What is that?
Oh, Superman's archenemy picks up a giant green rock and you can't tell what it is? Why does Superman like her so much?
And Clark just feels like a robot most of the time. He rarely expresses any kind of actual humanity about him, which sucks because, like I said, Superman is all about humanity.
Just hold on tight. Is everyone all right?
Stop, don't come back.
So much of this movie focuses on them together and apart, and it really doesn't work because they're not likable. They are so terrible in these performances that it makes this movie so unbearable to sit through. There was one thing that at the time when it came out, everybody agreed was the best part of the movie, but sadly nowadays you can't really enjoy it in the same way, and that is Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor.
Tonight. Didn't your dad ever teach you to laugh before you leap?
Spacey's performance as Luthor is legit really good. He gets all of the great elements of this character that should be presented on screen. I'd even say he's better than Gene Hackman, because Hackman was surprisingly low-key in a lot of his performances in that movie.
Otisburg?
And of course, he blows Jesse Eisenberg out of the water. He has the stone-cold stares, the fits of rage, the narcissism, the weird moments of going over the top in his performance when he's explaining his plans. He is a legit really good Lex Luthor. But of course, anything Kevin Spacey is in now is automatically made awkward because of, well, what we know about him in private. And unfortunately, unlike most movies where he plays the bad guy, we don't get the pleasure of seeing him die at the end. This also makes the opening scene where the woman describes him really creepy.
You've shown me pleasures that I've never known.
Excuse me while I go throw up. And his part of the plot isn't much better than Lois and Clark's either, because it is so complicated and so poorly paced that it really makes it a struggle to figure out what he's actually doing through the movie. I will admit though, the part where we first see him and he takes off the wig in reference to Gene Hackman's performance, that actually was pretty funny.
You can keep that. The rest is mine.
I mean, it's better than Richard Pryor in Superman 3 for crying out loud. Also, admittedly, as for entertaining as he is to watch, it does suck that the villain is just Lex Luthor again, which is why Superman 2 is remembered more fondly over the other two, despite not being as good as the first one, because it actually had more villains in it. I know Superman doesn't exactly have the best rogues gallery in all of comics, but what about Brainiac, or Doomsday, or hell, even Darkseid? Go balls out and make him the villain of this movie, which I would actually like to see because, contrary to popular opinion, I actually really like the way Singer did Apocalypse in X-Men Apocalypse. He really got that character down well, and to see him do Darkseid, that would be awesome. It's always fun seeing Superman throw down with Darkseid.
Oh, really?
Well, okay, maybe it's not always cool. I mean, for crying out loud, even the video game had Bizarro in it.
Me destroy city because me am hero.
I think a lot of what makes this movie not work comes down to its director, that being Bryan Singer. Now, don't get me wrong, he has done comic book movies well in the past with the X-Men movies, but even going back to the best of those movies like X2 and Days of Future Past, they're still very silly, and there are some parts of the movie where it feels like it wasn't very well balanced because they had too many elements that they could handle in one movie, and there are some parts of the movie that feel rather shallow and hollow compared to some of the better, more well-developed parts of the movie. But to be fair, that is kind of what the X-Men comics are like. Superman, on the other hand, is not like that. Which is why Richard Donner works so well with the Christopher Reeves movies, because he knows how to get that perfect balance between campy and serious. I mean, just look at the Lethal Weapon movies, for crying out loud. Singer's style, at least at this point in his career, really doesn't work with Superman, with a really heavy emphasis on shadows, taking out as much colour as he possibly can, and just generally looking rather depressing and bleak. It probably would have worked well for Batman, to be honest, but of course they had a different director lined up for his next movie, movie, who ironically made it a lot more colourful than this movie. And I'm not saying that darkness isn't welcome in Superman. There are plenty of Superman stories out there that have removed a lot of colour, and it felt appropriate. But this is supposed to be a sequel to the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and those movies were incredibly bright and colourful. So this just feels really contrasting, and not in a good way either. It's also worth noting that the producer of this movie was John Peters, who's been a producer on tons of things in the past, and he always had this vision of a movie that he wanted to make with Superman, which had a giant spider as the main antagonist, and I'm not joking, with Nicolas Cage in the main role.
Well, why the hell didn't they make it like that?
Exactly. That would have been entertaining at the very least. We do get a few moments of Superman doing his thing and saving people, like in the previous movies, even if they don't tie into the story. And while it is good to see, and I'll give it credit, it's definitely something more than we ever saw in the Snyder movies, because he didn't really do any of that there. With Brandon doing such a bad job as Superman, it really ruins it. Even with the effects looking pretty damn good actually, especially for 2005, but that probably didn't help on the budget side of things, and that's probably why this movie never got a sequel, because it probably didn't perform as well as Warner Brothers wanted it to. Though granted, in the case of this movie, that's probably for the best. There was one aspect of this movie that I thought had potential when watching it, but they completely wasted it. That being with Superman having a son, though admittedly this does bring up the question of when he was conceived, considering that he and Lois only had sex once in the movies, and at that point he didn't have his powers, so shouldn't that also carry on to his son? He does nothing throughout the whole movie, except this. But do you think that would lead to anything? Wrong! Yep, nothing comes of it, except a possible sequel that never actually materialized. Honestly, the only good part of the movie, which you can still watch now without guilt, is the opening sequence, which has stock audio of Marlon Brando as Jor-El, and it's also the last time we'll ever get to hear the John Williams Superman score again, and that's always a treat. But after that, you might as well turn it off, because it's nothing but downhill after that. Overall, the movie did have potential, but a mixture of the director not quite being the right choice, a terrible and unnecessarily complicated story, and an awful choice for actors in the main roles made this the very first movie I ever saw as a kid that when I walked out of the theatre I said, "That was awful!" And considering I came out of Cat in the Hat that same year and loved it, that is quite the achievement, Mr. Singer.
Way to kick a guy when he's down. He hasn't directed a movie in 3 years.
True, but given what he's been up to behind the scenes, that's not much of a surprise. Man, there's a lot of scumbags in this movie. But join us tomorrow where we'll be going over a movie that has a high-pitched, squeaky-voiced, annoying creature in it. And no, I'm not going to be talking about Alvin and the Chipmunks. This is going to be something much worse.
It's just how it sounds. My secret identity must never be found. I just need an abandoned street, a phone booth real discreet, where I can turn into the man people want me to be. And I know that you can see my underwear, and you can joke about it all you want.